Okay, so we are moving on to chapters 5 and 6. So again, we're going to combine a couple chapters. So we're going to talk about populations and communities. These are both terms you learned last chapter in our ecology. So population, again, is all of the organisms of that species in a certain area, and then community is going to be all the living things in that area. So we're going to kind of start a little bit narrower and then broaden it up as we go. So today we're going to start pretty simple. We're just talking about populations, and we're just going to describe them in a lot of different ways, and then specifically describe how they grow or shrink or stay the same. So when we describe populations, there's going to be a few different ways we can describe a population. Because if I ask you to describe something, there's a lot of different ways you can go about it. So we're going to try and specify this a little bit. Our first way is by talking about their geographic range. Okay, so geography, right, where something is. So a population's geographic range is just the place it lives. Pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. And you can tell in that picture in the top right-hand corner, we're looking at lions. So not only could I tell you, so on the right is where they are currently living. So I can tell you that, and that gives me a lot of information. But we can also compare it to a range in the past, like on the left there, and then that tells us a lot more about that population. The second thing we're going to talk about when we try and describe populations is growth rate. And really this, again, is very self-explanatory. This is just telling me, is the population growing? Is it getting bigger? Is it shrinking, right? Are there less of those animals? Or is it staying the same, right? Those are pretty much your three options. The growth rate then, based on that, is either going to be positive, negative, or zero. So if my growth rate is positive, my population is growing. If my growth rate is negative, my population is shrinking. And if my growth rate is zero, that population is staying the same. Okay, then we're going to talk about density and distribution. So density, if you think back to last year when we talked about density was kind of how many particles you had in a certain area, right? If it's really heavy and a small piece is really heavy, it's really dense, they're really packed tightly together. It's going to be the same thing here. So population density just tells me how many individuals I have in a certain area. So if I went out and counted the number of white-tailed deer in a section of land, okay, that would be my population density. I could go to a couple sections over and do the same thing, and then I can compare those densities, and wow, there's a lot of deer that like to hang out in this section and not in this. Population distribution then tells us how those individuals are actually spaced out. So are they all in one little corner, right? Were they all spaced out randomly? There's different patterns that we can tell, because that again tells us a lot about them, right? Were all those deer together, or did I spot 2 and then 1 and then 3 and then 1, how were they arranged? When we talk about population distribution, we're going to have 3 patterns that we're going to talk about, and they're going to be random, clumped, or uniform. And again, those are just as self-explanatory as they sound. So random, these go in a different order, but random is like these flowers in the middle, right, where I have a big clump of flowers here, and then there's none, and then there's a couple, and then there's a couple more, and then there's another big clump. Okay, there's no rhyme or reason to it. Clumped is a big clump, right? So if I have my herd of elephants here, but I have no other elephants within miles, right, that's a very clumped population distribution. Uniform, okay, if I have a bunch of penguins and they're all spread out evenly, right, like there's almost a pattern or there's the same amount of space between them all, that is a uniform population distribution. Okay, so we're going to focus on that population growth aspect of it. So the size of a population, obviously there's a lot of things that go into how big or small a population is. Okay, so we have to look at the birth rate, so how many new organisms are being born every year. The death rate, right, how many are dying every year. We need to look at immigration, and we need to look at emigration. So the difference between, I'm sure you have all heard of immigration. Okay, the difference between them, immigration, if you think about somebody who immigrates into the country, right, an immigrant, they're coming into our country, right? Emigration would be the opposite. So emigration is when you are leaving. So if I leave the United States, I would be emigrating. I'm leaving away. And then the country I go into, I'm an immigrant. So in, kind of similar. So immigrant is coming in, emigration is going out. And it'd be the same thing with populations, right? If a new organism moves into that population, that's immigration. If they leave to wander off or do whatever, that's emigration. We are going to talk about two patterns of growth. The first one is exponential growth. So if you've talked about exponential growth in math, this is the same thing. So in exponential growth, this is going to happen when we have ideal conditions, we have unlimited resources, there is nothing slowing down the growth of that population. That population is going to increase exponentially, right? Skyrockets, goes up really fast. And because they're growing, right, the larger it gets, the more it's going to grow. And then it gets larger, and then it grows faster. And you're going to get almost that straight up and down line like you would when you're, graphing exponential functions in math. So if we want to think about this, kind of put this in perspective, some bacteria reproduce really quickly, okay? They can reproduce almost, every 20 minutes or so in the right conditions, obviously. So if you were to let them just reproduce, okay, these bacteria somehow had unlimited food, unlimited space, just ideal conditions, the right temperature, everything was perfect for them to keep reproducing, okay, it would take about 36 hours, after about 36 hours, so a day and a half, there'd be enough bacteria to form a layer that covers the entire planet, so the entire surface of Earth, by about 1/2 meter, which is about 1.5 feet deep. Okay, and think about it, bacteria you can't see. Bacteria are all around you, you can't see them. So to be big enough to cover 1.5 feet around the entire world is a lot of bacteria. Okay, this is exponential growth. Realistically, that isn't going to happen very often. About the only time you're going to see exponential growth in nature is when a population moves into a new environment. So think invasive species, right? They come into that new environment, nothing can kill them, nothing wants to eat them, they've got all the food they want, and they take over. Okay, that would be exponential growth. But even then, usually, right, eventually they're going to run out of space, or they're going to run out of food, or they're going to run out of something. And that's not, exponential growth is not going to continue indefinitely, but that initial population growth would be exponential. If you look at it on a graph like this, that exponential growth is going to kind of have a J shape, right? So if you trace it up, it's a weird looking J, but it would be a J. Okay, and this one obviously is showing actually human population growth, and we are now higher than this. Obviously, this graph only goes to 2000, so we have continued to go up. Our other pattern of growth is going to be logistic growth. So logistic growth, you're going to have a period of exponential growth, but then it's going to slow down and stop. And so you can see that on this graph here, right? We have this really steep part, that'd be my exponential growth. And then it slows down, it's not quite a straight line, and then pretty soon that growth basically stops, okay? And it evens out. This is going to create, and again, it's a really weird looking S, but if this was a little bit flatter for a while, it's going to almost look like an S-shaped curve instead of that J-shaped curve that we saw for the exponential growth. So when you look at this logistic growth, we can figure out what we call the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is going to be the maximum number of individuals an environment can support. So maybe this section of land can support 25 deer. Okay, if there's more deer than that, maybe there's not enough food for them all. Or maybe there's not enough shelter for them all. or maybe there's not enough water, or maybe there's too many predators that they have to be out in the open and then they get eaten. Okay, but the maximum number of individuals that environment can support, that's our carrying capacity. And if you notice, and this is really important, so pay attention, write this down because you're going to have to do this on your assignment. Okay, this carrying capacity is wherever that graph flattens out. So this straight line, or even if this one that's kind of purple one that's going up and down, if you find that straight line that it runs through, okay, that's my carrying capacity. So for this population, this carrying capacity would be just about 1.6 million. Okay, so it's where it flattens out. That is my carrying capacity. That is how I find it on a graph. That is going to occur when my birth rate and my death rate are about equal. Right? I have the same number of organisms dying as I have being born. Population stays about the same. Obviously, immigration would also have to be about the same, because otherwise, if you have a huge influx coming through immigration, your birth rate and death rate being equal wouldn't be enough to make that even. Okay, and just because, so this blue line, like we said, is this really nice, perfect, oh, look at that, the carrying capacity. Again, in nature, that population is not going to stay exactly. My carrying capacity is 25 deer. There's going to be exactly 25 deer there every single year. Okay, that's not realistic. It's still going to rise. They're going to go over it. Some of them are going to die off, then it's going to drop a little bit, and then rise, and drop, and rise, and drop. Okay, but it's all going to be right around that carrying capacity. So again, if I drew this line kind of through the purple, that would be my carrying capacity. Okay, last little bit here. So relating to carrying capacity, right, that population grows. Something is going to stop it from growing. Limiting factors. That's what a limiting factor is. So it controls the growth of a population, right? It limits the growth of a population. And these limiting factors can be biotic or abiotic factors. So if we remember from last year again, or not last year, last chapter, okay, biotic, living things, abiotic, non-living things, right? The food source, that's a biotic factor. It's going to limit your population, okay? Water being available or not, obviously is also going to limit the growth of a population. That would be non-living. That's an abiotic factor. We're going to break these down into two types as well. So I have density-dependent limiting factors. So population density, right, is how many of those organisms I have in an area. So a density-dependent factor is something that limits a population more as that population increases. So the bigger my population is, the bigger this factor is, really. The more it's going to limit or kill off some of that population. Okay, so this is things like competition, overcrowding, disease, predation, food, right? Okay, my space. If I have, a whole section of land and I'm one deer, space is not an issue, right? Food is probably not an issue, okay? If I have a section of land and there's 300 deer, okay, maybe now space is an issue. Maybe now food is an issue. If I have 3,000 deer, now it's definitely an issue, among other things. Okay, disease is another one. Think about, okay, if you get sick with something, but there's not another organism anywhere close to you, you're probably not going to get anybody sick. Those organisms aren't going to die. Whereas if you're all packed together in a close area, you're more likely to spread that disease around. Okay, and then if it's something that kills off organisms, they're more likely to die, right? Why do you think that you guys all get sick when you come back to school? Because you're all crammed in here together, right? Your population density goes up, and then we pass germs back and forth. Okay, predation, right? If you're one organism and you're hiding from a predator, it's pretty easy if you've got some space. If there's a bunch of you, the chances of all of you being able to hide, a lot less likely. Okay, our other category then is density-independent factors. So these are things that affect all populations equally. Okay, population density means nothing here. So there could be 2 deer, there could be 200 deer. They're all going to be affected exactly the same by these factors. So these are things, a lot of them come from Mother Nature, right? Weather. If there's a drought, it doesn't matter if I have 1 tree or if there's 100 trees, right? They're all going to be suffering. Okay, natural disasters. A tornado comes through, it doesn't care. A flood comes through, it doesn't care how many organisms are in its path, it's going to wipe them out, right? Deforestation, right? We're taking out the entire forest, doesn't matter how many organisms are in there. So those are all going to affect the population equally. Again, could be really, really high population, could be really, really low. Either way, they're all affected the same. So that is what I've got for you today. And we will work on this a little bit in class when I see you.